I didn't know the night would end with an envelope on my kitchen table. I didn't know a single sentence could erase 40 years. I didn't know the night would end with an envelope on my kitchen table. I didn't know a single sentence could erase 40 years. What I didn't know was this, that a man can lose his house and survive, but losing his place as a father, that's something you don't walk away from unchanged. But before any of that happened, before lawyers and documents and 3 a.m. signatures, there was something simpler. Something I thought was unbreakable. I was his father. I'm 66 years old now. My hands are rough in places they shouldn't be, and my knees complain every morning like clockwork. I wake up early, make coffee the same way I've made it for decades, and sit in the quiet before the world starts asking things of me. That quiet used to feel earned. These days, it feels exposed. I raised my son mostly alone. His mother and I didn't plan it that way. Life just took turns we didn't vote on. She worked nights for a while. I worked days. Then I worked nights too. When money was tight, sleep was the first thing we cut. I learned how to pack lunches with one hand while tying a tie with the other. I learned how to show up tired and still pretend I wasn't. I never kept score. That's important. Some fathers remind their kids what they sacrificed. I wasn't one of them. I believed love didn't need receipts. If my son grew up steady, if he had a chance to build a life without constantly looking over his shoulder, that was enough. That was the deal, at least in my head. We bought the house in the mid-90s, back when the neighborhood was quiet and a little forgotten. It wasn't an investment. It was shelter. A place where homework got done at the kitchen table and birthdays were celebrated with store-bought cake and too many candles. I fixed what broke. I paid what was due. I stayed. When my son grew up, moved out, built his own life, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt successful. That's the part people don't talk about. When your child leaves and you don't feel lonely, you feel finished in a good way. Like you did what you were supposed to do. Years later, when he called and said he wanted to come back for a while, I didn't hesitate. He used careful words, practical words. He said I was alone. He said the house was big. He said family should be together while they still can. Those words work on men like me. I told myself this was what everything had been leading to. Full circle. A quieter chapter where I wasn't needed as much, but still mattered. Where my role shifted from provider to presence. I didn't see danger in that. I saw dignity. People like to think betrayal arrives loudly. Slamming doors, raised voices, anger. That's not how it came to my house. It came politely. It came organized. It came wrapped in concern, and I didn't recognize it for what it was, because I wasn't looking for a revenge story. I was looking at my son, and I still believed being his father meant something that couldn't be negotiated. I was wrong. When my son called, it wasn't on a Sunday. That should have meant something to me, but I missed it. Sundays were our routine. Short calls, safe updates, nothing too heavy. This time he called on a Wednesday afternoon. His voice measured, careful, like he'd practiced the conversation before dialing. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking about you." People underestimate how powerful that sentence is to a man my age. He talked about practical things first. The cost of living where he was, the kids growing fast, the pressure of keeping everything together. Then he paused, just long enough for me to lean in without realizing I had. "And you," he said. You're alone in that big house. I remember looking around the kitchen while he said it. The same table, the same chair by the window. Nothing felt empty to me until he named it that way. He didn't ask outright to move back. He suggested it gently. Said it might make sense. Said family should be together while they still can. He talked about safety. What if I fell? What if something happened and no one knew for hours? He said those things the way doctors do. Calm, reasonable, impossible to argue with without sounding stubborn or afraid. I told him I was fine. I meant it. I had my routines. Coffee at the same hour every morning. A walk around the block. A neighbor who waved. That was enough for me. But he didn't push. He just let the silence do the work. A week later, he called again. Then again. By the time he said, "Maybe we come stay for a while," it felt less like a request and more like a solution I'd already agreed to. Here's something I want to ask you. Just think about it for a second. If your grown child tells you they're worried about you, do you hear concern or do you hear an accusation? At the time, I heard love. I wanted to hear love. They arrived on a rainy afternoon. Boxes, suitcases, noise. The house filled up fast. Shoes by the door. Voices down the hallway. It was chaotic, but there was energy in it. And I'll admit, part of me liked that. The place felt alive again. I offered them the master bedroom. It just made sense. Closer to the kids' room, easier for everyone. I moved into the smaller room down the hall without a second thought. I told myself this wasn't about giving anything up. It was about making room. That's how it starts, by the way. Not with demands. With small adjustments you barely notice agreeing to. At dinner that first night, my son raised his glass and said, "We're lucky to have you, Dad." Everyone smiled. I smiled too. I believed it. But even then, there were moments I brushed past too quickly. The way he looked around the house, not nostalgically, but thoughtfully. The way he asked what I planned to do long term. The way he said, "This place is worth a lot now." Like it was trivia, not history. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was what family did. You make space. You adapt. You don't question intentions, especially not your own child's. That night, lying in my new room, listening to unfamiliar footsteps in a house I thought I knew, I had a strange, fleeting thought, one I didn't let finish forming. What if coming back wasn't about me being alone, but about something else entirely? I turned over and went to sleep. It didn't change all at once. That's the part people don't understand. Nothing was taken from me in a single moment. Things were reframed. Quietly. Politely. Like a discussion that kept happening whether I was part of it or not. At first, it was small talk. My son would stand in the living room with his coffee, looking around. Not the way you look at a place that raised you, but the way you look at something you're evaluating, measuring, calculating. "Real estate around here is crazy," he said one morning, scrolling on his phone. "This place down the street sold fast, way over asking." I nodded. I'd heard the same things from neighbors. It didn't feel personal yet, just information. Trivia. Then the questions started to change. Do you ever think about downsizing? Have you thought about what this house will look like in 10 years? Maintenance alone is going to get harder for you. For you, not us. I'd answer the same way every time. I said I was comfortable. I said I liked things the way they were. I said I wasn't planning on going anywhere. And every time he smiled and said, "Of course, just thinking out loud. That phrase became a kind of permission slip. I noticed he started getting the mail before I did. If I asked about it, he said he was just helping, making sure nothing important got missed. I told myself it was practical, responsible. That's what good sons do, right? He talked more openly about numbers after that. Not in a greedy way, never like that. He spoke the language of reason, market value, timing, opportunity. He said things like, "You've done well, Dad," as if the house were proof of good behavior rather than the place my life had unfolded. One afternoon, I caught him taking photos of the kitchen, the counters, the light by the window. He said it was just for reference, for ideas. I didn't ask what ideas. I didn't want to sound suspicious. Men my age learn early that suspicion gets you labeled difficult. That's when the house stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling like a topic. At dinner, conversations drifted toward long-term plans. Not arguments, never arguments. Just discussions where the conclusion always leaned the same direction. Toward efficiency, toward logic, toward what made the most sense. And slowly, without anyone saying it outright, I became part of that conversation too. Driving at night might not be great for you anymore. You forget things sometimes. That's normal. This place is big. You don't even use half of it. None of it was false. That's the danger of it. Truth, used without kindness, still cuts. I started noticing how often he used words like managing, overseeing, handling, never asking, never sharing. It wasn't hostile. It was worse than that. It was casual. I didn't confront him. I didn't even admit to myself that something was wrong. I told myself this was just how things went when children grew up and parents grew older. A shift, a role change. I told myself I was being too sensitive, but late at night, lying in that smaller bedroom, listening to the house move around me without me, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not fear, not anger. Displacement. The house hadn't changed. The walls were the same. The floors still creaked in the same places. But somehow, it no longer felt like it belonged to my life. It felt like it was being prepared for its next owner. And for the first time, a thought settled in that I couldn't push away. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being phased out. He didn't bring it up right away. That was deliberate, I think. He waited until things felt settled, until the noise of moving in had faded and the house had accepted its new rhythm. Once routines form, people stop asking questions. It was a Tuesday evening. Dinner was already cleared, the kids were upstairs, and the television murmured in the background without anyone really watching it. My son sat across from me at the table, with a folder resting against his knee. He didn't open it. He didn't even touch it at first. "Dad," he said, "can we talk about something boring for a minute?" I smiled. "If it's boring, you picked the right audience." That made him laugh. A real laugh. The kind that lowers your guard. He talked about planning, about how life gets complicated if you don't think ahead. He mentioned friends whose parents hadn't prepared, how messy things got when something unexpected happened. Probate, taxes, delays. He used those words the way people use seatbelts as an analogy. Something you hope you won't need, but you'd be foolish not to have. "I just want to make sure everything's clean," he said. Simple, efficient. Then he slid the folder onto the table. Inside were papers. Neat, official-looking. Tabs where signatures would eventually go. He pointed to nothing specific. Just let it sit there, like an option. "It doesn't change anything," he said quickly. "Not really. It just puts things in order. Makes it easier down the line." Down the line. That phrase again. I flipped through the pages slowly. I didn't understand all of it. Some of it I recognized, terms I'd heard before, words that sounded harmless when spoken aloud. Trust, authority, management. They were dressed up nicely, like furniture arranged to make a room look bigger than it is. "I'll need to have someone look at this," I said. The room shifted. Not much, just enough. "Of course," he replied, a little too fast. "Absolutely. I figured you'd say that." He leaned back, relaxed again, but something had already passed between us. A small, invisible thing. The way his eyes flicked to the folder, the way his hand rested on it, just for a second longer than necessary, like it might slide away if he let go. "This isn't emotional," he added. "It's practical." That word landed heavier than he intended. Practical suggests there's a correct answer. It suggests disagreement is inefficiency. I nodded anyway. I told him I appreciated him thinking ahead. I meant it too. I wasn't ready to accuse my own son of anything. That kind of thought doesn't arrive fully formed. It creeps. After he went upstairs, I stayed at the table with the folder open. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. I reread a few paragraphs, then stopped. My chest felt tight. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation you get when a familiar road suddenly has too many signs pointing in directions you didn't expect. I closed the folder. That night, lying awake, I replayed the conversation. Not the words, the tone. How calm he'd been, how reasonable, how certain that this was simply the next step, not a choice. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself this was what responsible families did. Still, something wouldn't settle. I realized then that I hadn't been asked what I wanted. Not once. The assumption had already been made that planning meant compliance, that practicality outweighed permission. By morning, the folder was back where he'd left it, waiting. And for the first time since he came home, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about preparing for the future. It was about deciding who controlled it. It happened after one of the quietest dinners we'd had since my son moved back in. No tension, no raised voices. The kids talked about school. Someone laughed at something on television. For a moment, I let myself believe I'd imagined everything that had been bothering me. When the plates were cleared and the kitchen settled into its evening stillness, my son stood up and reached into a drawer by the counter. He didn't look at me when he did it. That should have been my warning. He placed an envelope on the table, right where his mother used to sit. It wasn't sealed. "Read it when you're alone," he said. That was all. No explanation. No preface. He didn't wait for a response. He just turned and walked down the hallway like he'd finished an errand he didn't want to linger over. I sat there for a long time with my hands in my lap. The envelope was plain. No return address, no logo. Just my name written neatly on the front, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "Dad, I'm not your son." I don't remember picking it up. I remember the weight of it when I did, heavier than paper should have been. I waited until the house was asleep. The lights were off. The refrigerator hummed. Rain tapped against the window in that steady Oregon way that makes everything feel farther apart. I took the envelope to the kitchen table and opened it carefully, like it might cut me if I wasn't gentle. Inside were 3 things. The first was a typed document, legal language, dense, formal. I recognized enough to understand what it was. a statement releasing him from any moral or financial obligation toward me. Not a will, not a fight. A clean declaration. Distance. Formalized. The second was a copy of a petition for guardianship. Not filed yet, just prepared. My name typed neatly at the top. A section describing diminished capacity. Blank spaces waiting to be filled in. The third was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. Just one sentence. This isn't personal, it's practical. That was when it hit me. Not like anger, not like panic, like something being quietly removed. I'd expected confrontation someday. Accusations, maybe. Bargaining. What I hadn't expected was efficiency. The careful separation of emotion from action. Like the years I spent working overtime, skipping vacations, holding things together were variables to be accounted for, then set aside. I sat there until my coffee went cold in my hands. I wasn't being punished. I wasn't being blamed. I was being reclassified. All those nights driving home exhausted. All those mornings packing lunches and tying shoes. All the decisions I made so he wouldn't have to start his life from zero. None of that was being denied. It was being declared irrelevant. I realized then that this wasn't about the house. The papers in that envelope didn't take a single thing from me yet. What they did was worse. They told me exactly how my son saw me now. Not as a father, not as someone whose sacrifices carried weight, but as a logistical problem that needed to be handled cleanly. I folded the papers back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer beneath the table. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't even feel surprised anymore. I felt erased. And once you understand that someone has already decided your love doesn't count, you stop asking them to recognize it. That night, lying awake in the dark, I made a quiet promise to myself. If my life was going to be treated like a line item, then I would make sure I was the one holding the pen. I expected anger to show up first. That's what people talk about when they're wronged. The heat, the pulse in the temples, the urge to say something sharp and permanent. None of that came. What came instead was quiet. The next morning, the house moved around me like nothing had happened. Coffee brewed, doors opened and closed. Someone laughed down the hall. My son spoke to me the same way he always had, polite, measured, careful not to linger. If he noticed anything different in my face, he didn't mention it. Or maybe he assumed I'd already adjusted. That word again, adjusted. I carried the envelope inside me all day like a bruise no one else could see. I went through the motions. I nodded when spoken to. I answered questions. I even smiled once or twice. Not because I felt fine, but because smiling took less energy than explaining why I wasn't. Here's the strange part. The pain didn't come from what he planned to do. It came from how cleanly he'd done it. There was no argument in his papers, no judgment, just an efficient conclusion that my role, my decades of showing up, no longer factored into the equation. I started replaying moments from years ago, not to relive them, but to test them. Late nights, missed opportunities, choices made quietly so he wouldn't have to carry the weight of them. I wasn't looking for praise. I never was. But I'd believed, without ever saying it out loud, that those things meant something, that they counted. According to that envelope, they didn't. At some point that afternoon, I realized I wasn't sad in the way people expect. I wasn't mourning a loss. I was standing in the aftermath of a decision that had already been made without me. That's a different kind of grief. It doesn't ache, it hollows. I understood then why I hadn't felt the urge to argue. Arguments are for people who think the other side is still listening. What unsettled me most was how reasonable it all looked from the outside. Anyone could have read those documents and nodded along. Practical, sensible, forward-thinking. That's how erasure happens, by the way. Not with cruelty, but with justification. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the expression staring back. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't defeat. It was the look of someone who has just been informed, politely, that his contributions no longer qualify. And something shifted. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. If my sacrifices could be dismissed without discussion, then I had misunderstood the rules. This wasn't a family conversation anymore. It was a matter of self-preservation, dignity, control. I didn't confront my son. I didn't ask him why. I didn't ask him if he meant it. Those questions belonged to a version of me that still believed recognition was something you could request. I folded that version away. Before turning off the light, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about how many men my age carry stories like this quietly. Stories where the injury isn't loud enough to explain, but deep enough to change everything. Let me ask you something before we go on. If the people you sacrificed for decided, calmly, logically, that your sacrifices didn't count, would you fight to be understood? Or would you do what I did next and protect yourself without asking permission?